When all 9 justices agree on something in today's America, you know something massive just happened, and I mean massive. Today, the Supreme Court just dropped a unanimous decision, 9-0, not 8-1, not 7-2, 9-0. In a country where we can't even agree on what day Thanksgiving should be, the highest court in the land just spoke with one voice. So what does this mean for you, for your rights, for the entire nation? Stick around, because what I'm about to break down affects every single American, whether you realize it or not. Let me paint you the picture of what went down today in Washington, D.C. The Supreme Court handed down a decision that legal experts are calling one of the most significant rulings in over a decade. And here's the thing that makes this absolutely mind-blowing. It wasn't even close. This wasn't a split decision where 5 justices barely edged out the other 4. This was unanimous. All 9 justices, appointed by different presidents coming from different legal philosophies, conservative and liberal alike, all looked at the same case and said, yeah, we agree on this one. Now, if you've been paying attention to American politics lately, you know that's about as rare as finding a unicorn in your backyard. Let me give you some context here. Over the last 10 years, the Supreme Court has averaged roughly 70 to 80 cases per term. Out of those cases, only about 30 to 40% end up being unanimous. The rest, split decisions, 5-4, 6-3, justices going at each other in dissenting opinions that read like academic cage matches. But not today. Today was different. So what was this case actually about? Without getting into the legal jargon that makes your eyes glaze over, here's the straightforward version. This case dealt with a fundamental question about the relationship between federal power and individual rights. The specifics involve whether the government can compel certain actions that might conflict with constitutional protections. I know. That sounds like textbook language. Let me break it down even further. Imagine you're going about your daily life. You're working, hanging out with friends, posting on social media, doing your thing. Then the government steps in and says, hey, you need to do this thing. And if you don't, there will be consequences. The question before the Supreme Court was, does the government have that authority in this particular situation, or does it cross a line that the Constitution draws in the sand? The court looked at the Constitution. They looked at centuries of legal precedent. They examined the arguments from both sides. And then all 9 justices said, nope, the government doesn't have that power here. Let that sink in for a second. In an era where we're constantly debating the scope of government authority versus individual freedom, the Supreme Court just drew a clear, bright line. And they didn't just draw it with a slim majority. They drew it with the full force of all 9 justices backing it up. Now, you might be thinking, okay, cool, the court made a decision. Why should I care? Fair question. Let me tell you why this is absolutely crazy. First, the unanimity itself. Do you understand how rare this is becoming? In the 2022-2023 Supreme Court term, only about 29% of cases were decided unanimously. That's less than 1 in 3. The court is increasingly divided on major issues: abortion, gun rights, affirmative action, environmental regulations, voting rights, you name it, there's probably a split decision on it. But this case, 9-0. Justice Clarence Thomas, one of the most conservative justices on the bench, agreed with Justice Sonia Sotomayor, one of the most liberal. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, appointed by Trump, agreed with Justice Elena Kagan, appointed by Obama. Chief Justice John Roberts, who often tries to find middle ground, didn't need to play mediator because everyone was already on the same page. When was the last time you saw that level of agreement on anything important in America? Second, the implications are staggering. This isn't some narrow technical ruling about tax law or administrative procedures that only affects 3 lawyers and a paralegal in Montana. This decision has nationwide implications. It affects how the federal government can exercise power. It affects what rights individuals can assert against government action. It affects the balance of power that the founders built into our constitutional system. Think about it like this. The Constitution is like the operating system of America. It's the code that everything else runs on. When the Supreme Court issues a unanimous decision about how that operating system works, they're essentially updating the software that governs 335 million people. That's not small. That's enormous. Third, and this is where it gets really interesting, this decision came at a time when trust in institutions is at historic lows. According to Gallup polling from 2023, only about 47% of Americans have confidence in the Supreme Court. That's down from over 60% just a couple decades ago. People are cynical. They think the court is just another political body where justices vote based on party loyalty rather than the law, but then the court goes and does something like this, a 9-0 decision that transcends the usual partisan divides. It's like a reminder that, hey, maybe there are still some principles that everyone can agree on. Maybe the law isn't just politics in robes. Maybe, just maybe, there's still something holding this whole experiment together. All right, let's dig into the actual legal reasoning here because this is where it gets fascinating. The court's opinion, written by the Chief Justice with concurrences from several other justices, laid out a framework that will guide lower courts for years to come. And the logic is surprisingly straightforward once you cut through the legal language. Here's the core argument. The Constitution doesn't just list rights in the Bill of Rights and call it a day. The entire structure of the Constitution is designed to protect individual liberty by limiting government power. The separation of powers among the three branches, the division of authority between federal and state governments, the enumeration of specific congressional powers, all of this is meant to create a system where government power is checked and balanced. So when the government tries to exercise a power that goes beyond what the Constitution allows, it doesn't matter if that power might lead to good outcomes or solve important problems. The Constitution doesn't care about good intentions, it cares about limits. The court cited cases going back to the founding era. They quoted James Madison. They referenced Federalist Papers. They built an argument rooted in the original understanding of constitutional structure. But here's what makes this decision even more powerful. They also looked at modern implications. The justices understood that we're not living in 1787 anymore. We have technology, social media, global interconnection, challenges the founders couldn't have imagined. But the court said that the principles underlying the Constitution are timeless. The specifics might change, but the fundamental idea that government power must be limited to protect individual freedom remains constant. One justice wrote in a concurring opinion, "We may face new challenges in a new era, but the wisdom of constitutional limits is not new. It is ancient, and it is essential." Think about that for a moment. In a world where everything feels like it's moving at light speed, where AI is reshaping society, where the internet has transformed how we communicate and organize, the Supreme Court just said the old rules still apply. The constitutional framework still works. The limits still matter. That's a powerful statement. And when all 9 justices make that statement together, it carries weight that reverberates through the entire legal system. Now, let's get to the question you're probably asking. How does this actually affect my life? Because let's be real, Supreme Court decisions can feel abstract and distant. They're written in dense legal language. They cite cases from the 1800s. They're not exactly TikTok-friendly content, but this decision, it matters for your daily life in ways you might not immediately see. First, it sets a precedent for how much power the government can exercise over individual choices. Depending on the specific area of law this case addressed, it could affect everything from what information the government can compel you to provide, to what actions you can be required to take, to what consequences you might face for exercising your constitutional rights. Let me give you a hypothetical that brings this home. Imagine you're a college student. You post something on social media, maybe a political opinion, maybe criticism of a government policy, maybe just a meme that someone finds offensive. Now imagine the government tries to compel your university to take disciplinary action against you, or tries to compel a tech company to remove your post, or tries to compel you to attend some kind of re-education program. Before today's decision, there might have been legal gray areas, questions about whether the government could do that indirectly, even if it couldn't do it directly. Debates about where the line is between government persuasion and government coercion. After today's decision, that line is clearer. The government's power to compel, to coerce, to force action that implicates constitutional rights, that power has limits, and those limits are now reinforced by all 9 Supreme Court justices. Second, this decision empowers lower courts. Judges across the country, from district courts to appellate courts, now have a unanimous Supreme Court precedent to cite when they're deciding cases. That's huge. It means that when someone brings a lawsuit claiming the government overstepped its authority, judges have a clear, unambiguous framework to apply. Think of it like giving referees a definitive rule book. Before, they might have had to interpret unclear rules or make judgment calls in gray areas. Now, the highest court in the land has given them a clear standard. Third, and this might be the most important point, this decision reinforces the idea that your rights aren't subject to majority vote. They're not dependent on which party controls Congress or who sits in the White House. There are constitutional protections that exist regardless of politics. In a democracy, majority rule is important, but in a constitutional republic, individual rights are paramount. And when the Supreme Court unanimously reminds the government of that fact, it's protecting something fundamental about what makes America, well, America. Let's talk about how this plays out in the real world, because abstract legal principles only mean something if they have concrete effects. Consider a few scenarios that this decision could impact. Imagine the government wants tech companies to remove certain types of content from their platforms. Maybe it's misinformation, maybe it's content critical of government policies, maybe it's something else entirely. The question is, can the government compel private companies to censor speech that the government itself couldn't censor directly? Before today, that was a massive legal question with courts going different directions. After today's unanimous decision, there's now a clearer framework for analyzing when government action crosses the line from persuasion to coercion. If the government is effectively forcing private actors to do what the government couldn't do directly, that's a constitutional problem. That affects whether you can speak freely online without worrying about indirect government censorship. Now imagine the government wants access to your personal data, your location history, your search queries, your communications. Maybe they claim it's for national security. Maybe it's for law enforcement. Maybe it's for public health. The question is, what constitutional protections do you have? Can the government compel tech companies to hand over your data without a warrant? Can they require you to provide information that might be used against you? Today's decision reinforces constitutional limits on government power to compel action. That could strengthen privacy protections by making it harder for the government to do end runs around constitutional requirements. That affects whether your digital life remains private or becomes an open book to government surveillance. Here's a different angle. Imagine the government wants to require businesses to operate in certain ways. Maybe it's environmental regulations, maybe it's labor requirements, maybe it's rules about what products can be sold or how services can be provided. Now, the government clearly has regulatory authority, but there are limits. The government can't violate constitutional rights even in pursuit of legitimate regulatory goals. And if today's decision strengthens the framework for identifying when government power exceeds constitutional limits, it could affect the entire regulatory landscape. That affects the economy, job markets, and the opportunities available to you as you enter the workforce or start businesses. Here's one more. The United States isn't just one big monolithic government. We have a federal system where power is divided between national government and state governments. That division is intentional. It's meant to prevent any one level of government from becoming too powerful. If today's decision reinforces limits on federal power, it could strengthen state authority in certain areas. That means the state where you live might have more control over certain policies, which could lead to more variation across the country, but also more local control. That affects everything from education policy to criminal justice to healthcare, depending on where you live. Let me give you some historical perspective here, because understanding where we've been helps explain why today's decision matters so much. The Supreme Court has issued unanimous decisions throughout American history, and some of them changed the country forever. 9-0 decision declaring school segregation unconstitutional. Chief Justice Earl Warren worked behind the scenes to ensure unanimity because he knew that such a momentous decision needed the full authority of the court. That unanimous decision helped launch the civil rights movement and transform American society. 8-0 decision, Justice Rehnquist recused himself, requiring President Nixon to turn over the Watergate tapes. That unanimous decision reinforced the principle that no one, not even the president, is above the law. It led directly to Nixon's resignation. Unanimous decision establishing that federal law is supreme over state law and that the federal government has implied powers beyond those explicitly listed in the Constitution. That decision shaped the entire relationship between federal and state governments for the next 2 centuries. See the pattern? Unanimous Supreme Court decisions often come at pivotal moments when the court needs to speak with maximum authority about fundamental constitutional principles. That's what happened today. The court looked at a question about the limits of government power and the scope of individual rights, and they said, this is important enough that we all need to agree. We need to send a clear, unmistakable signal about where the Constitution draws the line. History suggests that unanimous decisions like this one become landmarks. They're the cases that law students study decades later. They're the precedents that shape legal reasoning for generations. So when you hear about a 9-0 Supreme Court decision in 2025, don't think of it as just another case. Think of it as potentially historic. Think of it as the kind of decision people might still be citing in 2075. Now let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, because this decision doesn't exist in a vacuum. We're living in a time of incredible tension about the role of government in society. On one hand, we face massive challenges: climate change, economic inequality, national security threats, public health crises that seem to demand coordinated government action. On the other hand, we cherish individual freedom and worry about government overreach. That tension is ancient. It's been part of American political life since the founding, but it feels especially acute right now. Social media has amplified every political disagreement. The 24-hour news cycle treats every issue as an existential crisis. We're more polarized than we've been in decades, maybe since the Civil War era. And into this chaotic, divided moment, the Supreme Court just issued a unanimous decision about constitutional limits on government power. Think about what that means. It means that even in our deeply divided society, there are still some principles that transcend partisan politics. There are still some constitutional boundaries that everyone, from the most conservative to the most liberal justice, agrees must be maintained. That's not naive optimism. That's not wishful thinking. That's what actually happened today. The court reminded us that the Constitution isn't a liberal document or a conservative document. It's an American document. It establishes a framework that's meant to protect everyone's rights, regardless of which political tribe they belong to. And here's the thing: you need that framework. I need that framework. We all need that framework, because political power shifts. Today's majority becomes tomorrow's minority. Today's protected group becomes tomorrow's vulnerable population. The only way to ensure that everyone's rights are protected over time is to maintain constitutional limits that don't change based on who's in power. That's what the founders understood when they created a constitutional republic rather than a pure democracy. That's what the Supreme Court reinforced today with their unanimous decision. The bigger picture is this: in a time of chaos and division, the rule of law still matters. Constitutional principles still hold. And sometimes, even in 21st century America, we can still find common ground on the things that truly matter. So what happens now? This decision will ripple through the legal system for years. Lower courts will apply it to new cases. Lawyers will cite it in their arguments. Government officials will have to consider it when crafting policies. You'll probably start seeing news stories about how this decision affects specific situations. There will be follow-up cases that test the boundaries of today's ruling. There will be debates about what it means in different contexts. But the fundamental shift has already happened. The Supreme Court has spoken, and they spoke unanimously. For you, as someone living in America right now, this decision is part of the ongoing conversation about what kind of country we want to be. Do we want a country where government power is unlimited as long as it's pursuing good goals? Or do we want a country where constitutional limits constrain government power even when those limits might be inconvenient? The Supreme Court just answered that question. All 9 justices answered it the same way. They said, the Constitution matters, limits matter, your rights matter, and in a world where everything feels uncertain and unstable, that's something solid to hold on to. Here's the question I want to leave you with. What does it mean to have rights in a democracy? Because that's really what today's decision is about. It's about the relationship between majority rule and individual freedom. It's about whether the government can do whatever it wants as long as enough people support it, or whether there are lines that can't be crossed no matter how many people want to cross them. The Supreme Court said there are lines, constitutional lines, and those lines protect you even when you're in the minority, even when public opinion goes against you, even when the government has what it considers to be good reasons to override your rights. That's powerful, that's essential, and that's what all 9 justices agreed on today. So as you go about your life, as you exercise your rights, as you participate in this democratic experiment we call America, remember, you have constitutional protections. They're not granted by politicians. They're not subject to popular vote. They're fundamental limits on government power that exist to protect your freedom. And today, the Supreme Court reminded everyone of that fact. Look, I know Supreme Court decisions aren't exactly viral content. They're not as exciting as the latest celebrity drama or sports highlights, but they matter. They shape the country you're growing up in. They affect the rights you have and the freedoms you can exercise. Today's 9-0 decision is one of those moments where the court stepped up and drew a clear line. And when all 9 justices agree on where that line is, you know it's significant. If this breakdown helped you understand what happened and why it matters, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like button, drop a comment below telling me what you think about this decision. Do you think constitutional limits on government power are important, or do you think the government should have more flexibility to address modern challenges? I want to hear from you because this affects all of us. And the more we understand about how our constitutional system works, the better equipped we are to protect it. Thanks for watching. Stay informed, stay engaged, and remember, your rights matter. I'll see you in the next one.